Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 9 of our secular Bible study series in which we get to look at 1 Samuel. This book is action-packed. It has some of the best known and best loved Bible stories out there, right next to some of the worst verses in the entire Bible. There's so much to go through here, but before we do, I want to make a quick adjustment to last week's episode about Ruth. Many of you, and rightly so, were calling out that I was too gracious with the book, that the book does indeed have more going on than I alluded to, that it is not this beautiful love story, etc., and you are right. The point I think I was trying to make was that among all of the books that are all problematic, because they all fall under the domain of incorrectness and God's immorality if he were real, etc., this one is the least problematic. And with God out of the story, humans were left to kind of their own condition here, still suffering from the fallout of what God had already instilled. And they weren't perfect, but we don't expect humans to be perfect. That's never been my issue with the Bible. My issue with the Bible has been where God has intervened, his inconsistencies, his character flaws, etc. But I do want to point out what was pointed out to me so clearly, that Boaz and Ruth is not a love story, and I recognize that. Ruth seduces Boaz. Naomi's very plan for Ruth, as they describe it, is for her to go and take advantage of this man when he's drunk. That's what the men would do when they would sleep next to their crops at the time of harvest. And typically they had prostitutes. This was kind of a known gig. So it's not like Boaz is this chaste man that Ruth is corrupting, but at the same time, Naomi and Ruth are coming up with a plan to trap him by having sex with him when he is asleep and getting Ruth pregnant, so therefore forcing his hand. Similar to what Lot's daughters will do with him. Isn't the Bible wonderful? Now, uncovering his feet can be a euphemism for sex, but at the same time, we see Ruth change her mind a little bit from the plan that Naomi laid out for her to just tell Boaz, like, hey, this is why I'm here. This is what I want from you. So it's a little more upfront, even if it seems to happen after the fact that she's just assaulted this man. Boaz clearly wants her now for her sexual prowess and her youth and beauty, and she only wants him for this transactional relation of keeping her and Naomi alive, because that's what you needed back then. You needed a man. These women were so looked down upon for being widows, and especially Ruth for being a foreigner, a Moabite. And the thing that also got pointed out, and this will be the last thing on Ruth, and then we'll move into 1 Samuel, is even Ruth's first marriage was not some beautiful thing. Naomi's sons, as far as we can tell, went and conquered and took and stole her, as we see littered all over the Old Testament. She would have been in much better standing being a wife of a Israelite man, but once he died, now she's really screwed, right? And thus the need for Boaz. So those are a couple course corrections that I wanted to make. Again, I still think the way the book is put together is absolutely lovely. I still think that there is some beautiful things going on with these characters. Naomi is just your typical scheming mother-in-law who wants to steal your son and help you get pregnant by a drunk man. Just kidding. Obviously, it's all awful. Naomi really is one of the ones that comes off looking the worst in this book when you really get into it. Okay, enough. Let's move on. 1 Samuel. Let's get right into book overview. So 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel was never meant to be broken apart. This is just simply due to scroll length. And the way that I've always viewed them is together. So I really have to be careful that I don't bleed into 2 Samuel here. But where are we at? Well, Ruth is this side story within Judges, but Judges is really the last thing that has happened on our timeline. And we get the very last judge, though he's more commonly referred to as a prophet, Samuel. Now, if you recall, the book of Judges ends with this: they had no king, so every man did what was right in their own eyes, which I think is incredibly problematic, as we discussed when we did the Judges overview, because what's going to change with a king? They still had leaders. These leaders were judges. They were still appointed by God. So this idea that they can't be moral or follow the law, even though they have God in their company, still showing up physically for them without some king leader, is just silly to me. And then we see a reversal of this by the time we get to 1 Samuel. Samuel, as a judge and prophet, is kind of talking to God like, hey, they want a king. And God's like, fine, they obviously have bad motives for this, but let's do it anyways. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Where does the book actually start? It starts with Hannah, Samuel's mother. Hannah could not conceive. Finally, she did. She does this whole song and poem for God, and really it sets out what will be the entirety of the book. So we'll talk more about that during the literary analysis in point 4, but that is how our story starts. So then we have Samuel in his judge and prophet duty. We also have Eli, who is a high priest at the time. And these are two of the leaders that are happening in the first part of 1 Samuel, as we get a new enemy really introduced to us. It had been all these other tribes, and now we get the big rivalry, the Philistines. Israel gets a little cocky, and they say, let's let the Ark do our fighting for us, the Ark of the Covenant, which is something that I'm sorry I've not gone over in much detail. But this thing has supernatural powers embedded into it. It's to be taken care of with the utmost respect and reverence. And they go and they just put it on the battlefield, and they say, let's do this thing. The fight ensues. It is a huge battle. Israel loses 30,000 foot soldiers. That's an insane number. They lose. They lose because of their pride. God does not let them win. So 30,000 of them die, which is a huge loss for them. The Philistines steal the Ark of the Covenant. They take it back to their god Dagon, put it right there in the temple with him, which I don't understand the thinking there, because we see they're afraid of it. They said, the Philistines, when the Ark came out, they said, oh, there's God. God showed up in the camp. They're actually saying gods. These are the gods who did those things at the Red Sea. These are the gods who did the plagues. But yet they'll just capture God's very essence here in the Ark, put him in their temple with their other god, and just roll the dice. And sure enough, God, with no help from the Israelites whatsoever, defeats Dagon, which is actually this funny little scene where the statue night over night keeps falling over in front of the Ark in kind of a bowing motion, cuts off his hands, defeats Dagon, and sends plagues among the temple, the priests, the people, etc. Until the Philistines are like, nope, we don't want it. You can have it back. So they return the Ark. Now, about this time, because of the losses that were suffered, Israel starts to say, hey, we need a king. We need a king like the Gentiles have a king, which again, it's so funny to me. They were called out to be set apart and chosen by God as a unique tribe. They know this is God's plan for them. They know they're called to a higher morality. God gives them judge after judge after judge, all of which actually do accomplish their mission. They help regain Israelite out of captivity and oppression. And it's just the sin of the Israelites that causes the cycle again. Why they think a king is going to be any different, I have no idea. Why they would stray further from God's plan for them to be like the Gentiles, I have no idea, but they want one. Apparently they're so good at arguing with Samuel that he argues with God that God gets convinced that this is what he'll do, and we get our first king, Saul. Saul is tall and handsome and brave and a good warrior. So then we see the rise of Saul and the fall of Saul. And during that time, the rise of David. And then more of what happens with David's fall happens in 2 Samuel, I believe. So we'll have to chop that up to make sure that we get it correctly within each book. Saul starts off hot. He is just winning victory after victory. The people love him. And what do we see happen? Pride, once again. This is a big theme in this book. We'll get to that more in point 5, whether it's Goliath or Saul or the people's pride themselves with like what they did in the Ark of the Covenant, etc. So we're getting kind of to the halfway point here in the book, and a few things really start picking up steam. Samuel resigns and says, listen, this is all on Saul now. Saul is definitely king. He is doing well, like I mentioned, but now he's on his decline. He's on his pride. And eventually Samuel goes and says, hey, you screwed up. We're going to take this thing away from you. And Saul is so distraught, but he's still acting as king at this time. Samuel then goes and anoints David. You probably remember the Bible story of Samuel visiting David's father and looking at all his sons and going to the smallest and the weakest and saying, this is the one, which blows the family away, blows David away. Then we get into David and Goliath. Then we get into David and Jonathan. David is on this upswing while Saul knows that he's going down. And at first he needs David. He utilizes David. He makes David a general in his army to win battles after battles because David is favored by the Lord. Now the people are starting to love David, and it gets to the point where Saul says, nope, I'm going to try to take this back. I need to kill David. So David goes on the run. Saul and his men go after him. And many times here you get David having a chance to kill Saul and saying, nope, I'm going to let God deal with it. And we're supposed to look at David here and say, wow, so merciful, so loyal, so faithful. And we're supposed to compare it against Saul's rage and pride and struggle against God to kill someone anointed like David. Now, personally, I think Saul gets a bit of a bad rap, and it comes from one of the worst verses in the entire Bible. So we'll go over that in the problematic verses in point 7. While David is on the run, he saves a few cities still, avoids Saul, has a couple opportunities not to kill Saul. Samuel ends up dying during this time. Then we get Saul's whole visit to a medium to speak with Samuel from the dead. Oh my goodness. Again, we'll cover it in point 7. And the book ultimately ends with this horrific stuff. The tables get turned. The Philistines have a great victory. David loses his wives and children. They've been stolen, and Saul dies a gruesome death. That is a very quick overview of a ton of stuff that happens in this book. It can be confusing if you're just reading it one time through, or you've only heard parts of it. Like, when did David actually become king? Why was Saul actually dethroned? Wait, was David actually anointed king while Saul was still in leadership? And yes, the time scale here has a lot going on at the same time. And Samuel working in between all these plot lines to contrive things. First working with the people, then to work with God to get Saul, to get a king, then working with God to dethrone Saul, but not physically yet, just to let him know it's coming, which makes no sense. While at the same time letting this young boy know he's going to be king and anointing him. So then you have this great tension between Saul's fall and David's rise. And there's so much that happens between these two two men. It's maybe the most interesting relationship in the Bible that I can think of. This tension, this love, this hate, this respect and reverence, and the whole time David seeing his future self in what Saul will be happening. Like, the foreshadowing is insane. The symmetry is insane. This is a well-crafted story. But again, we're supposed to take all of this literally. David is a central figure in the genealogy of Jesus. It is David who finally unites the 12 tribes into the one kingdom of Israel. But some of that happens in 2 Samuel. So let's move out of point 1 into point 2 and start talking about authorship and date. Now, I don't have a whole lot of new information for you here. Again, this is part of the Deuteronomist hypothesis, which states that books like Judges, even Joshua, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings are part of this same collection that was eventually put together around the same time. That time is delicate. Most likely, though, it's the exile of Babylon period, which is happening hundreds of years after these events, like 500 years after these events, I think. Where we're at is around 1050 to 1000 BC, so the 11th century BCE. We are continuing to advance, but again, just remember that all of this is getting put together most likely hundreds of years later from multiple different editors and scribes trying to make sense of old oral tradition and some few written lineages. Of course, the Jewish tradition and some of the more fundamentalist Christian belief is that Samuel wrote this book. Just like he wrote Judges, that just does not make sense. Again, for one, we see Samuel die in this book. But some would say, no, it wasn't just Samuel. He compiled most of it, and then a few people in his inner circle put the finishing touches on once he died. I guess that's possible, but there's no good reason to believe that. And we have so many good reasons to believe about the multiple authors and scribes as we see different strands of authorship and text and styling and word choice used throughout these books. So we've kind of beat a dead horse, as a few books now have been under the same scope. We're going to move right on to the historical accuracy, context, background, etc. Once again, until we have the true establishment of the kingdom of David, which is where we get our first archaeological evidence, the House of David, and an inscription. None of this is backed up by history. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it does mean most of it was probably exaggerated. There were probably bases or roots for some of these stories. Did we go from a confederation of tribes under a different leadership structure into some kind of a monarchy for Israel? Yes, probably, especially as we consider that they most likely broke off other tribes within Canaan before coming into their own. Was there probably both internal and external struggle for this tribe as they found their place in the world and their development of a nation, fighting amongst themselves for the right kind of leadership, and externally amongst some of the other Canaanite tribes? Yes, there's good reason to believe that that is true. We can see just from the tribes at the time that this is a lot of what happened. How you set up your economy, how you set up your political system, what kind of leader was elected, if the gods of the time had anything to do with it or not, moving closer to what became a common constant of the monarchy, where we started having king rule instead of just tribal leaders. All of this is par for the course around this time. These tribes, one of the tribes that are mentioned the most here in this book is the Philistines. We have good archaeological evidence that the Philistines definitely existed. So there are segments and fragments of truth. Now, if an Ark of a Covenant from a storm god Yahweh was ever taken by the Philistines into their god Dagon, which had this huge battle where Yahweh prevailed over Dagon and sent plagues until the Philistines returned this magical, futuristic sci-fi device back to the Israelites, did that happen while losing 30,000 foot soldiers? No. So there's just some obvious issues here, but there's probably little nuggets or kernels of truth along the way. So moving right into point 4, one of my favorites, literary analysis. I think Ruth was one of the most interesting so far, or maybe even Genesis or Exodus. Just the structure of Ruth again was so beautiful, but let's talk about how 1 Samuel breaks down. This is a narrative structured story. We have a timeline of events. We see the rise and fall of multiple individuals, but there are some things weaved into it. The very fact that we start with Hannah's song or Hannah's prayer, Hannah's poem, depending on different translations. We saw it with Moses. We saw it during some of the Judges. We see kind of this cry of poem and praise for both desire and thanksgiving to God, to Yahweh. So the very fact that that starts us off is kind of this cinematic theme. And there's really 3 parts to her prayer that lead to the 3 main issues covered in this book. So that's a cool technique that's being used. And then we immediately drop it, move straight into that narrative structure. Plot point, plot point, plot point, person, place, person, place, person, place. Within that, though, we start getting into some new kinds of scripture, prophetic and wisdom literature. These, from this point on, are going to start being utilized a lot more. And then last element or technique that is used is this contrasting characters. There's a lot of contrast that happens here from the judges to the kings, from Samuel to Saul, from Saul to David, between David and Jonathan, between the Israelites and the Philistines, and we just see the need for obedience to God among all else as we look at these opposing sides, not just of the individuals against each other, like bad Saul versus good David, but good Saul versus bad Saul, good David versus bad David. So I think it's really interesting and will lead us right into our main themes here. So we already covered dangers of pride and disobedience. This is clear. I don't think I need to say so much more here. We could rope in consequences of human action at this point as well. When left to their own devices, look what these people did. The role of the prophets would be a huge theme. We're going to get a lot of prophets after Samuel. These are people that can divinely speak with God in a unique way. We see God doing this throughout much of the Old Testament from this point on with signs and dreams and even other what would be considered darker supernatural doings. There seems to be now this more mystical element. We had all that direct communication happening back with Abraham and Moses, even with God being around in the tabernacle, moving with the people, wandering with them in the wilderness. Even as late as Joshua, we see God showing up physically and doing insane things. But then he started to utilize the judges more, and now that we're moving into a monarchy, we're going to have kind of this special position of the prophet as the intercessory link between the people or even the kingship and God himself. It's probably one of the most important things established in this book from a theme perspective. A last theme, if I had to pull one out, and again, there's so many we could talk about. We could talk about morality, which would be kind of a joke. We could talk about God's sovereignty here, but I think that motive seems to matter so much in this book to God. What was Israel's motive for wanting a king? It was bad, so he handed them over to their own sin. What was Saul's motive for wanting to reign? Well, at first it was pretty just, and then it got tainted. And when his motive changed, his outcome changed. Going back, what was Hannah's motive for wanting a child? And the blessing that went with that motive because she was willing to hand that child back over to God. The motive behind David, sweet little humble David, who just wanted to please his king and do his part for his people and his family. And again, we'll see in 2 Samuel as David's motives begin to change, so does the outcome. So motive even over action, because most of these events, most of these people do horrendous things, but we can see very similar things be blessed and cursed based off their motive. So let's move on to point 6, reception and influence. As usual, first I always like to look at the religious significance among the Jewish tradition. We've now left behind the Pentateuch and the rest of the books of Moses, and we move into the Nevi'im, the prophets section of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. For the Christians, this is just lineage. This is just a pit stop on the importance to Jesus. We get some lovely stories that we like to tell our children about having faith, like David and Goliath, and doing big things for God, while ignoring all the problematic things that are to come, and just see it as, okay, we're finally getting the kingdom established. Here's David. He's our central point between Adam and Jesus. Pull out some fun stories and let's move on. From a cultural impact alone, I don't think you can beat the story of David and Goliath. This has transcended the Bible. This has transcended into so many iterations of the young hero, of courage and bravery, of winning against all odds. It is everywhere. It's usually children's favorite Bible verse. Even outside of the Christian belief, again, this theme is just overwhelming, and we see it trickle down into so many different aspects. Also, on a smaller note, I think Saul has really become the archetype for a complex character. I think that Saul, again, has on a plain reading this, he was just the first king and then he turned bad. No, Saul wanted to please God so badly. Read this book and see Saul's heart for God. His confusion between being anointed and then having that anointing taken away from him, his trying to get that back, trying to get back in God's good graces. And yes, at some point he turns against and turns into some kind of self-preservation, but it's not just that black and white. And we see it again in that tension between his relationship with David, and it's really fascinating from a literary perspective, seeing that baked into different tragic heroes throughout famous ancient literature and even closer to modern day has been astounding and really is, to me, one of the more interesting parts of this book. Of course, from art and visual representation and even music, there's a ton that comes from this book. But one thing that's of note here is that many of the psalms that get attributed, the psalmist being in some cases David later on in the Old Testament, come from what's happening in the events in this book, especially during the period period where David is hiding out from Saul. And we see this faithfulness and hope and trust in the Lord that gets put into so many of the Psalms that people have come to love. So I think that's all I'll say for point 6, and we're going to spend a good amount of time with 7, Contradictions, Errors, Misconceptions, Problematic Verses. I think really what we'll focus on today are the list of contradictions in this book, and then I want to spend some time with these problematic passages. There's a lot of quick ones we can go through, and then there's some we'll spend a little bit more time explaining. Saul's meeting with Samuel, was it private or was it public? 9:27 seems private, 10:1 seems very public. 13:5 versus 13:50 for the size of the army is vastly different. Saul's family's background gets confused in 9:1 through 2, and then in 14 verse 51. Jonathan's knowledge of David is all over the place, mainly the differences in chapter 18 versus chapter 20. David's relationship to the Ark of the Covenant and where the Ark of the Covenant is at certain times is misrepresented. These differences are found in chapter 6 versus chapter 7. The fate of Eli's household is a huge one. Does God judge them forever, or does God end up forgiving them? There are so many more to point out, but these are some that I think are maybe the most solid, and I want to spend most of the time here for problematic verses. For this, I'll just be reading straight from the text for you, and our first one will be from 1 Samuel 16:14. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. This is what leads Saul to seeking out the harp player of David to come and help distress him. Now, in the context of how God's Spirit comes in and out of people, this is fine. When God puts his Spirit upon you, you're able to do things. We see the Spirit of God going into Samson in that last moment as he pushes the pillars down. So withdrawing that Spirit is one thing, but purposely sending evil or harmful spirits, again, tell me about free will. And is it just so that he can concoct this reason to get David in front of Saul, so that David can have a reason to get to fight Goliath, so that his name can be known, so that he can become king? Does God really have to work like this? This is just my point about free will in general. And I mentioned it last Sunday on my prophecy video, that for prophecy to work, you almost have to rob people of their free will, because God has to concoct certain things to happen to get a desired outcome of his will. So highly problematic to me. Let's go to 1 Samuel 6:19. And he struck some of the men of Bethshemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. He struck 70 men of them, and the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great blow. So again, just more issues here with God's character. The Philistines return the Ark of the Covenant after all that bad stuff happens. And just like the first few people poking around looking like, oh, is this the Ark? Did they bring it back? Bam, 70 of them drop dead. Like, these are God's chosen people. These are just innocent bystanders. This has nothing to do with someone braggadociously going and saying, look, I'm greater than God. Let me touch the ark and get away with it. It's just the most insane reaction. Okay, the next one is from chapter 18. We'll start in verse 25. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. This one is really kind of tame compared to so many of the other things that happen, but I just want to point out that this is Saul, who is God's chosen king. And even if he's lost a little faith in Saul at this point, which has happened, doesn't he love David? Doesn't he desire for David to be this next great king? And so look at what's orchestrated here. Look at the sickness of this. It's Saul sending David on a suicide mission. This is why we can bring God into it. This isn't just the doings of men, because who helps David secure this victory and thus buy his bride? God. By murdering not just 100, but let's do double. David and his mighty men go out and kill 200 Philistines for the fun of it. Not in a battle, just sneaky murder, mutilating their bodies, cutting off their foreskins, and bringing it back. This is a sick game. Even the fact that foreskins would have this kind of matter or meaning within this community is 100% to do with God. And there are Christians that will just read this and it's just no big deal. Yeah, it's just kind of a weird thing. Oh well. Can you imagine if our troops in an actual battle with some enemy in the Middle East, afterwards, the general went around and cut off 200 foreskins and gave it to our president, and then the president was so pleased with it that he handed over his daughter to the general to be wed? We'd have some questions about the state of our leaders, would we not? But when it's in the Bible, it's just some kind of old tradition thing we don't understand. Oh well. Disgusting, the excuses we make. Let's get to a fun one. 1 Samuel 28, and this takes place over kind of a long one. This would be like verses 7 through 20. Here's the highlights. Saul is not having a good time. He sees David's eminent planet rise and taking over of his throne. He can't hear from God anymore. God is no longer talking to him in dreams or visions or by prophets. Samuel's dead at this point. And so Saul goes sneakily in, disguises himself, and meets with a medium. And he says, hey, I need you to bring up a dead guy for me. And she says, oh, King Saul won't allow that. He got rid of the necromancers, people who speak to the dead. She's like, I won't do it. I don't want to die. And Saul says, I swear to you by the Lord, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure we're not supposed to make promises using the Lord's name, but that's okay, that she will not be harmed. So she says, fine, who do you want me to bring up from the dead? And he says Samuel. And so she starts her little ritual. And first she says that a god is coming up out of the ground. That is something we should look into. But for the sake of time, we're going to move straight on to then comes up a man in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel. Also at this point, the medium realizes that she's now with Saul. And she says, why did you deceive me? No big deal. Saul's just a liar. And Samuel says, why have you disturbed me? Why have you brought me up? This is just more evidence that the ancient Jews had no concept of hell. The main idea is that they just went to sleep. They went to sleep with their fathers. So by bringing up dead Samuel, you have awoken him from his slumber. None of this seems to be something that's crazy to any of these individuals. Samuel's just up from the dead like, yeah, I'm kind of mad you did this. What do you need? The medium's like, well, it worked again. It always works. I'm very good at connecting people with the dead. And Saul, who knew the Lord on the most personal level you can, knew that this practice existed and worked. So he outlawed it and then utilized it for his own gain. So him and Samuel have a conversation. He's like, what can I do? God's left me. And he's like, God left you because you suck. Like, you knew this was going to happen. By the way, tomorrow you and your sons are going to die by the Philistines. Bam. Now we have dead people predicting death. And the last verse, I think, is one of the most interesting parts. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel along with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. So again, we have Samuel, a beloved prophet who did everything right, and Saul, who is completely sinful and turned away from God, and they'll be in the same place tomorrow. They'll be down in Sheol, not up. They come up from it. This isn't hell. This isn't heaven. This is like the most clear contradictory verse against everything we see in the New Testament, along with so many issues with the necromancy and the mediums, that these things exist, etc., and that they're not demonic. It's not a demon that's connecting Saul with the holy prophet Samuel. It's just a power that exists in the world at this time. This is ludicrous. But let's move on to the next one. Just a fun little verse in 31:4-6. We get this conversation where Saul knows it's the end. He knows he's going to be killed and captured by the Philistines, so he asks his armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer refuses to do it, so Saul takes his own life. Nothing like self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess. All right, let's do two more, and they're similar in theme, and one of them may not seem so bad, but to me it's always stuck out as one, if not the most ridiculous verses in the Bible. So we'll end with that one, but before we do that, let's go way back to chapter 15. Just a fun verse of genocide in verses 2-3. Thus says the Lord of hosts, not Saul, not David, the Lord of hosts. I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So this verse does a few things. First of all, so much for God's forgiveness. Do you know how long ago Amalek was? And now every single one of them, children, infants, animals, etc., need to die. This isn't hyperbole. This is literal, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. Also, all of those dumb excuses that didn't work before, they definitely don't work now. These are not giants. This is not the Nephilim. These people are not inherently evil or wicked. This is clearly just another tribe, at the worst, who dealt harshly with the Israelites. It's not like they wiped out the Israelites. It's the Israelites here who are going to go commit genocide at the request of their Lord. Not some evil king, not some wayward judge. Okay, so this last verse is happening within the context of what I just read in chapter 15, but we see it start back here in 13. Saul fights the Philistines and does an unlawful sacrifice. 13. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So, okay, we have this unlawful sacrifice, and bam, God was going to have Saul's lineage rule forever over Israel. Forever means forever. That means we would still have a descendant of Saul today. But he took all that away while simultaneously already having this plan for this man after his own heart, seems like Saul never really had a choice to do so differently. And also, this is an insane overreaction from God, but we're just getting started. The crux of all this comes later in 15. So I read to you from verses 2 and 3, where God commands a literal killing of every single Amalekite or Amalekite. And the main way that people get out of this verse is that they say it's hyperbole. It's like saying, go kill them all on Sunday for football. You don't really expect the other team to murder everyone. It's just a saying. But look what happens next. Verse 14, and Samuel said, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction. So it's very clear here that the only thing that survived this genocide was a few sheep and oxen, only the best of those, meaning we did follow the rest of the instructions. We killed every other animal, every baby, every child, every woman, and every man. This is not hyperbole if you have specific examples of the few things that were left alive. This is just beyond simple. Now, I won't read it all, but Samuel and him go back and forth arguing about it's more important to obey God's commands than to give God a sacrifice. And this is the thing that finally causes Saul to lose his throne. A following of his exact orders of genocide, but leaving a few animals as a sacrifice for him. That's the great atrocity. Not the genocide. You did that part right. You just didn't do it right enough. You didn't actually kill everything I wanted you to kill. I'm so glad all those children and babies and women are dead. That pleases me. I'm so glad the rest of the animals are dead. That pleases me. And yes, normally I love the smell of burnt offerings, so thanks but no thanks for these sheep and oxen. Right after this, by the way, Samuel goes on to chop a man to pieces. It says, before the Lord. So I'm sure God just loved watching that. That's it. That's 1 Samuel. Again, I think the reason that verse is so problematic to me is because it is not just that we clearly see genocide. It is not just that we clearly see there's no excuse of hyperbole, but it's also that even a man as devoted as Saul, trying to follow God to the best of his ability, torn between two commandments of total annihilation and reserving the best for a sacrifice to give to the Lord, thanking him for the battle that he allowed them to win, chose the wrong one and then lost his entire reign over it. And this has a trickle-down effect because it's going to be handed over to the Philistines before David takes it back. How much more death and destruction is now going to happen because God chose to deal with this situation in this way? Where is God's slowness to anger? Where is his mercy we hear all about? And by the way, this is just one of many. If you continue to read all of Saul's conquest and all of Jonathan's conquest and all of David's conquests that are coming up, it just continues in this fashion. Why do we worship this God? Why do we claim this God is good, loving, merciful, just, etc.? An honest reading of this Bible completely disagrees. So that's it. Thank you as always. Have a wonderful day. Take a look at the Patreon if you're liking these stories. And until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tier Iconoclast patrons, Shawn Skaggs and Jason Rollins, followed by my newest atheist advocate, Jarrod Nichols, for their incredible generosity. And also a special thanks to my 3 secular scholars. All other patrons are listed in the description of each video. Please consider joining this group if you enjoy these videos or believe in the channel's mission. Thanks and have a great day.